The Fulton County Traffic Court buzzed with the usual Monday afternoon chaos, a symphony of shuffling papers, muffled conversations, and the occasional sound of handcuffs clicking from the adjoining criminal court. Judge Marcus Henderson sat perched on his elevated bench, his black robe doing little to protect him from the failing air conditioning system that had turned the courtroom into a makeshift sauna. At 63, Judge Henderson had earned a reputation for running his courtroom like a well-oiled machine. 23 years on the bench had taught him every trick in the book, the fake emergency excuses, the theatrical sob stories, and the endless parade of the ticket must have gotten lost in the male defendants. Today, he'd already processed 47 cases with the efficiency of a seasoned conductor, but the heat was wearing on his patience. Next case, he called out, his voice carrying the weight of decades of authority. The bailiff, Officer James Martinez, a stocky man with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes, shuffled through a stack of papers. Case number 2024 TR 1542. Sarah Chen for speeding, Your Honor, Martinez announced, his eyes scanning the crowded gallery. The usual prompt response didn't come. Judge Henderson glanced at his watch. 2:45 p.m. The scheduled time for this hearing was 2:30 p.m. He despised tardiness almost as much as he despised the broken thermostat that was currently making his collar stick to his neck. The double doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open, drawing all eyes toward a young Asian woman who seemed completely oblivious to the disruption she was causing. She wore faded jeans, a navy blue sweater that had seen better days, and scuffed sneakers, an ensemble more suited for a casual Sunday brunch than a court appearance. The woman's dark hair was pulled back in a hasty ponytail, with loose strands framing her face as she quickly moved down the center aisle, her messenger bag bouncing against her hip. She was still checking her phone, thumbs flying across the screen, as she approached the defendant's table. Judge Henderson felt his blood pressure rise. In his courtroom, he'd seen respected surgeons, wealthy businessmen, and even fellow lawyers show proper respect by dressing appropriately and arriving on time. This woman's casual disregard for court decorum struck him as particularly galling. "Ms. Chen," he began, his voice carrying that special tone of judicial disapproval that had made countless defendants squirm. "Perhaps you have something more important to attend to than your court appearance today." The woman quickly tucked her phone away, finally looking up at the bench. Instead of the expected apologetic expression, she maintained a composed demeanor that only served to irritate the judge further. "No, Your Honor," she replied simply, her voice clear and professional, creating an odd contrast with her casual appearance. The judge glanced down at the citation in front of him. 47 miles per hour in a 30 miles per hour school zone. Looking back at the defendant, he noticed she couldn't be much older than 30, though something in her bearing suggested experience beyond her years. "Ms. Chen, do you make it a habit to arrive late to important appointments?" Henderson asked, using the same tone he often employed with his teenage grandchildren when they tested his patience. The growing discomfort in the gallery was palpable. The afternoon heat seemed to intensify the tension, and several spectators began fanning themselves with whatever papers they had on hand. Officer Martinez shifted his weight uncomfortably, perhaps sensing the storm brewing from his position near the bench. Little did Judge Henderson know, as he prepared to make an example of this seemingly unprofessional young woman, that the next few minutes would become one of the most memorable moments of his long judicial career, though not for the reasons he imagined. The wheels of justice were about to take an unexpected turn, and his carefully maintained courtroom decorum was about to be shaken to its core. Judge Henderson leaned forward, his hands clasped together on the bench, fingers interlaced in a gesture that regular court attendees knew all too well. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his face, deepening the lines of disapproval etched around his mouth. "Let's review your citation, Ms. Chen," he began, deliberately drawing out each word. 47 miles per hour in a school zone. During active hours, no less. He paused, letting the words hang in the humid air. "Would you care to explain yourself?" Sarah Chen stood at the defendant's table, her posture relaxed but attentive. A few strands of hair had escaped her ponytail, and she absently tucked them behind her ear. The casual gesture only served to heighten the judge's irritation. "Your Honor, I acknowledge that I was speeding," she responded, her voice carrying a hint of something the judge couldn't quite place. Not quite defiance, but certainly not the contrition he expected. The court clerk, Mrs. Patterson, who had served alongside Henderson for 15 years, glanced up from her stenotype machine. In her experience, defendants who began with such direct admissions usually had more to say, but Sarah Chen remained silent, waiting. "And your tardiness today?" Henderson pressed, gesturing at the large clock on the wall behind him. 15 minutes late to your own hearing. I suppose you acknowledge that as well." A few snickers emerged from the gallery, quickly silenced by Officer Martinez's stern look. The afternoon heat had grown more oppressive, and someone's cell phone chimed quietly, adding to the judge's mounting frustration. "I do, Your Honor," Sarah replied, still maintaining that inexplicable composure. "Though I would like to." "Ms. Chen," Henderson interrupted, his voice sharp enough to make his clerk flinch. "I've been presiding over this court for 23 years. In that time, I've heard every excuse imaginable. Traffic was bad. The GPS was wrong. The dog ate my court summons." He allowed himself a small, humorless smile. "But what I find particularly disturbing is your apparent lack of respect for this court." He gestured at her attire, his hand moving in a dismissive wave. "You appear before this court dressed as if you're heading to a coffee shop. You arrive late, engrossed in your phone, seemingly unconcerned with the gravity of these proceedings." The temperature in the courtroom seemed to rise another few degrees. A young law student in the gallery, who had been observing cases for a class assignment, scribbled frantically in his notebook, sensing the building drama. "The posted speed limit in school zones exists for a reason, Ms. Chen. Children's lives are at stake, and while you may treat this as an inconvenience to your day, I assure you that this court takes such violations very seriously." Sarah Chen shifted slightly, opening her mouth to speak, but the judge wasn't finished. He lifted the citation, studying it with exaggerated attention. "I see this isn't your first speeding ticket either. There's a citation here from 3 years ago." He peered at her over his reading glasses. "Perhaps the standard fine isn't providing sufficient motivation for you to follow traffic laws." A bead of sweat rolled down the judge's temple, but he ignored it, focused entirely on making his point. The usual fine for such an offense was $250, but Henderson had already decided that this case called for something more memorable. "Given your history, your dangerous disregard for school zone safety, and your obvious contempt for this court's time and procedures, I'm imposing a fine of $500. He paused, watching for the usual reaction: protests, tears, or angry exclamations. "Perhaps this will serve as a more effective reminder of your responsibilities as a driver." The gallery erupted in hushed whispers. Even Officer Martinez raised his eyebrows slightly. The fine was unusually harsh for a speeding ticket, but Sarah Chen's reaction, or rather her lack of one, would soon make Judge Henderson wish he had taken a closer look at the case file in front of him. The courtroom fell silent as Sarah Chen's hand moved toward her messenger bag. The canvas bag, worn at the edges and covered in barely visible coffee stains, rested against the defendant's table. Judge Henderson assumed she was reaching for her wallet, perhaps preparing to plead financial hardship, a common enough occurrence after his more severe fines. Instead, she withdrew a slim leather credential holder, its surface bearing the unmistakable eagle emblem of the Department of Justice. The motion was unhurried, deliberate, almost choreographed in its precision. A small smile played at the corners of her mouth as she held the credentials, not yet opening them. "Your Honor," she began, her voice taking on a different timbre now, clear, authoritative, and carrying the weight of federal authority. "Before I accept your ruling, I believe I should properly introduce myself." Judge Henderson's expression flickered momentarily as Sarah opened the credential holder, the gold badge catching the harsh fluorescent light. Officer Martinez, who had been standing at his usual post, straightened suddenly, recognition dawning on his face. "I'm Assistant United States Attorney Sarah Chen, currently serving in the Northern District of Georgia's Public Corruption and Criminal Civil Rights Section." She paused, allowing the information to sink in. "My tardiness today, which I sincerely apologize for, was due to an emergency hearing in Judge Matheson's federal courtroom. The young law student in the gallery dropped his pen, the plastic clatter echoing through the now silent courtroom. Mrs. Patterson's fingers hovered motionless over her stenotype keys, her usual professional detachment cracking as she glanced between the judge and the federal prosecutor. Sarah continued, her casual attire suddenly taking on a different context. "We've been tracking a police captain for months, Your Honor. This morning, we finally had enough evidence to secure an indictment. The hearing couldn't be rescheduled, and I came directly here afterward." She gestured at her jeans and sweater. "Hence my inappropriate attire, for which I again apologize." Judge Henderson's complexion had taken on an interesting shade, somewhere between the pale of shock and the red of embarrassment. The case file lay open before him, and now, too late, he noticed the occupation field he had overlooked in his haste to make an example of the tardy defendant. "The operation has been confidential," Sarah added, her voice carrying a hint of professional pride. "We've been investigating a corruption ring that extends into 3 counties. This morning's hearing was the culmination of 8 months of undercover work." The gallery had erupted into whispers again, but this time, Officer Martinez made no attempt to quiet them. He had worked with the federal prosecutor's office before and was likely already calculating how many retellings this story would get in the break room. "The speed violation occurred during a surveillance operation," Sarah explained, though she wasn't making excuses. "I accept full responsibility for exceeding the limit, even though it was in service of a federal investigation. No one is above the law, Your Honor, as I'm sure you'll agree." The irony of her last statement hung in the air like the afternoon humidity. Judge Henderson tugged at his collar, which had grown uncomfortably tight. The same authority he had wielded so confidently moments ago now felt as wilted as his robes. Sarah reached into her bag again, this time producing a checkbook. The leather cover was as worn as her messenger bag, bearing the scars of long hours spent in courthouse corridors and late-night office work. "Shall I make the check out for the full $500, Your Honor?" The question wasn't really a question at all. It was a masterclass in professional courtesy, delivered with the kind of subtle grace that only someone intimately familiar with the delicate dance of courtroom politics could manage. And as Judge Henderson struggled to maintain his judicial composure, he realized that his routine traffic court session had just become anything but routine. Judge Henderson's mind raced as he stared at the federal credentials still displayed before him. The courtroom seemed to shrink, the walls closing in as recognition dawned. Sarah Chen wasn't just any federal prosecutor, she was the Sarah Chen, whose name had dominated the Atlanta Journal-Constitution's front page just last week. "Ms. Chen, Assistant U.S. Attorney Chen," he corrected himself, his voice having lost its earlier authoritative edge. "I believe I've read about your recent work." The understatement of the year, her prosecution of the Reynolds human trafficking case had made national headlines, resulting in the liberation of 27 victims and the imprisonment of an entire criminal network. Sarah gracefully tucked her credentials away, that same composed smile still playing at her lips. "Yes, Your Honor. The Reynolds case concluded last Thursday. We're still processing additional suspects, which is partly why this morning's operation was so time-sensitive." The young law student in the gallery had abandoned all pretense of note-taking and was now openly recording the exchange on his phone, until Officer Martinez reluctantly motioned for him to stop. The afternoon heat seemed to intensify the judge's discomfort as he shuffled the papers before him, buying time to regain his composure. "I see here that your previous citation," he continued, desperately trying to maintain some semblance of judicial authority, "was also during an active investigation." The question came out more as a plea than an inquiry. "Yes, Your Honor, during the surveillance of a suspected drug trafficking operation." Sarah's response was matter-of-fact, professional. That case resulted in the seizure of approximately $12 million in illegal substances and the arrest of 9 cartel members. Mrs. Patterson, the court clerk, had given up any attempt at maintaining her usual stoic demeanor. Her eyes darted between the judge and the prosecutor as if watching a particularly engaging tennis match. The gallery's whispers had evolved into a steady murmur, punctuated by occasional gasps of recognition as Sarah's identity circulated through the crowd. Judge Henderson felt the weight of his earlier lecture pressing down on him like a physical force. His words about respect for the court and taking things seriously now seemed almost comically misplaced. Here was a woman who had dedicated her career to pursuing the highest level of justice, who had probably logged more courtroom hours in federal cases than he had in his entire career in traffic court. "I must say, counselor," he managed, attempting to salvage what dignity remained, "your handling of the Reynolds case was impressive. The way you connected the evidence across state lines." "Thank you, Your Honor," Sarah interrupted gently, saving him from his floundering attempt at professional recognition. "But perhaps we should return to the matter at hand." She held up her checkbook, still open and ready. "I believe we were discussing the fine for my speeding violation." The reminder of his harsh penalty hung in the air like an accusation. $500 for a first-time school zone violation. A fine that was nearly double the standard amount, imposed purely out of pique at her perceived disrespect. "About that," Judge Henderson began, his hand unconsciously moving to loosen his collar. "Given the circumstances, perhaps we should reconsider." "I insist on paying the full amount, Your Honor," Sarah interjected firmly. "As I mentioned earlier, no one is above the law. My position doesn't exempt me from traffic regulations, nor should it influence the court's judgment." She began writing the check, each stroke of her pen deliberate and precise. "Besides, I believe you made some excellent points about safety in school zones." The irony in her voice was so subtle that only those trained in legal nuance would catch it. Judge Henderson caught it, so did every lawyer, clerk, and law enforcement officer in the room. His earlier grandstanding had just been transformed into a masterclass in professional humility, delivered by someone who knew far more about judicial authority than he'd given her credit for. Sarah Chen laid her filled-out check on the defendant's table, the amount $500 written in crisp, clean strokes. Before she could slide it toward the clerk, the double doors at the back of the courtroom burst open. A tall man in a sharply pressed suit strode in, his FBI badge glinting on his belt. "AUSA Chen," he called out, his voice cutting through the tense atmosphere. "We need you back at the federal building." Captain Reynolds just started talking. The gallery erupted in barely contained excitement. Captain James Reynolds, the corrupt police officer Sarah had arrested that morning, was apparently ready to cooperate. Judge Henderson watched as Sarah's professional demeanor shifted subtly, her prosecutor's instincts visibly kicking in. "Your Honor," she turned back to the bench, "if I may explain the urgency of this situation." Judge Henderson nodded, grateful for any distraction from his earlier misjudgment. Sarah tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear and began speaking, her casual appearance now a stark contrast to her commanding presence. "Captain Reynolds' corruption case connects to 3 ongoing federal investigations. This morning's arrest was the culmination of months of careful surveillance and evidence gathering. We've been tracking his involvement in a scheme that reaches into the highest levels of local government." The law student in the gallery had somehow managed to edge closer to the front, his notebook forgotten as he hung on every word. Even Mrs. Patterson had stopped pretending to type, completely engrossed in the unfolding drama. The captain's department was responsible for protecting several high-profile drug trafficking routes. Sarah continued, her voice dropping slightly. "But more importantly, he had access to sensitive information about ongoing federal investigations. We believe he's been selling this information to criminal organizations for years." Judge Henderson leaned forward, his earlier embarrassment temporarily forgotten. "And he's willing to cooperate now?" "Yes, Your Honor, which makes timing crucial." Sarah glanced at her phone, which had begun buzzing incessantly. In cases like this, the first hours after an arrest are critical. Suspects are most likely to cooperate fully before they've had time to reconsider or be contacted by their associates. The FBI agent, who had been standing respectfully at the back of the courtroom, cleared his throat meaningfully. Sarah nodded in acknowledgement before turning back to the judge. "Your Honor, I want to be clear. This doesn't excuse my traffic violation or my tardiness to court today. The check for the fine is written, and I accept your ruling completely." She gestured to the paper on the defendant's table. However, if the court would permit me to leave now, there's a chance we could break open one of the largest corruption cases in Georgia's history. Judge Henderson found himself staring at the check, the amount he'd imposed out of petty irritation now seeming both excessive and insignificant in the face of Sarah's ongoing work. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. Here he was, having lectured a federal prosecutor about responsibility while she was in the middle of dismantling a major corruption ring. "Ms. Chen, counselor," he corrected himself again, "your fine is hereby reduced to the standard amount of $250. He raised his hand as she began to protest. "This isn't preferential treatment. It's the standard fine I would have imposed had I." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Had I taken the time to review your case properly." Sarah studied him for a moment, then nodded her acceptance. She crossed out the original check and quickly wrote a new one. As she handed it to Mrs. Patterson, multiple phones in her bag began ringing simultaneously. "You're excused, counselor," Judge Henderson announced, managing a small smile. "It seems you have more pressing matters to attend to." Sarah gathered her things quickly, her movements efficient and purposeful. As she turned to leave, the entire courtroom watched a casual speeding ticket violator transform into a federal prosecutor on a mission, reminding everyone present that appearances could indeed be deceiving. The murmurs in Judge Henderson's courtroom grew louder as Sarah Chen prepared to leave. The once stifling air now crackled with excitement. Courthouse regulars already pulling out their phones to text friends about the unexpected drama they'd witnessed. Nobody seemed to care about the broken air conditioning anymore. "Did you see her on Channel 11 last month?" a young paralegal whispered too loudly to her colleague. "She's the one who brought down that whole trafficking ring at the port." "My cousin works at the federal building," another voice chimed in. "Says she practically lives in her office." Guess that explains the casual clothes. Officer Martinez, who had maintained his professional composure throughout the proceedings, finally allowed himself a small grin. He'd worked security detail for one of Sarah's high-profile cases last year and had witnessed firsthand her meticulous preparation and unwavering dedication. Mrs. Patterson, still at her stenotype machine, was already fielding curious looks from other court staff who had wandered in after hearing the commotion. She knew this transcript would be requested multiple times before the day was over. In 20 years of court reporting, she'd never seen anything quite like this. As Sarah gathered her belongings, her phone buzzed again. This time, instead of silencing it, she answered, her voice shifting into what was clearly her prosecutor mode. "Chen here. Yes, I'm leaving now. Tell Detective Brooks to wait for me before starting the interview." The FBI agent who had delivered the news about Captain Reynolds held the courtroom door open, barely containing his impatience. Time was clearly of the essence, but Sarah paused at the defendant's table one last time. "Your Honor," she said, turning to face Judge Henderson, "I appreciate your fairness in reducing the fine to the standard amount. However, I meant what I said about accountability." She pulled out a second check and quickly wrote it. "This is a personal donation to the County School Zone Safety Program for the remaining $250. Judge Henderson's face reddened again, but this time with something closer to admiration than embarrassment. The young law student in the gallery furiously scribbled in his notebook, probably documenting what would become a legendary courthouse story. The Reynolds case she mentioned. One lawyer whispered to another near the back, "My firm wanted to handle that defense. Thank God we didn't." She submitted over 1,000 pages of evidence, color-coded, with an indexed appendix. The FBI agent cleared his throat again, more urgently this time. Sarah nodded and headed for the door, her messenger bag bouncing against her hip just as it had when she first entered. But now, everyone in the courtroom saw her differently. The casual jeans and sweater weren't signs of disrespect. They were the uniform of someone too busy pursuing justice to worry about appearances. As she reached the doorway, Sarah turned back one final time. "Your Honor, for what it's worth, you are absolutely right about one thing. School zone safety is crucial. Perhaps after the Reynolds case wraps up, I could come speak to the traffic court about our ongoing initiatives to protect school zones from drug trafficking. It's actually become a significant issue in several of our investigations." Judge Henderson, still processing everything that had happened, could only nod. The offer transformed his earlier lecture from an embarrassing misstep into an unexpected networking opportunity. The double doors swung shut behind Sarah and the FBI agent, but the energy in the courtroom remained charged. Mrs. Patterson finally looked up from her stenotype machine, meeting Judge Henderson's eye with a knowing look. They both knew that by tomorrow, this story would be circulating through every courthouse in Atlanta. Next case, Judge Henderson called out, trying to restore normalcy to his courtroom. But he couldn't help noticing that the young traffic violators in the gallery were sitting up straighter, suddenly very interested in the proceedings. Sometimes he realized the best lessons about justice came from unexpected places, or in this case, from an unexpectedly remarkable prosecutor in casual clothes. By late afternoon, the story had spread through the Fulton County Courthouse like wildfire. In the cafeteria, clerks huddled over coffee cups, sharing increasingly embellished versions of the encounter. In the law library, interns debated whether Sarah Chen's handling of the situation would make it into next semester's legal ethics textbook. Judge Henderson sat in his chambers, tie loosened, staring at the two checks on his desk. The first, for $250, was the standard fine he should have imposed from the beginning. The second, a personal donation to the school zone safety program, served as a gentle but firm reminder of his rush to judgment. A knock on his door interrupted his contemplation. "Come in," he called out, quickly straightening his tie. Mrs. Patterson entered, carrying a fresh printout of the day's transcript. "Judge, you might want to see this." She handed him a local news website pulled up on her tablet. They're already running the story. The headline read, "Federal Prosecutor Pays Double Fine After Traffic Court Judge's Harsh Ruling." Below it was a photo of Sarah Chen from last month's Reynolds trafficking bust press conference, looking polished and professional in a suit. A stark contrast to her appearance in court today. "It gets better," Mrs. Patterson continued, scrolling down. "Apparently, Captain Reynolds' confession led to 3 more arrests this afternoon. They're calling it the biggest police corruption bust in Georgia history." Judge Henderson leaned back in his chair, processing the information. The very case that had made Sarah Chen late to his courtroom was now breaking news. His minor traffic court session had inadvertently intersected with a landmark federal investigation. "Janet," he addressed his clerk of 15 years, "what's the protocol for returning a voluntary donation to a traffic safety program?" Mrs. Patterson raised an eyebrow. "You're thinking of returning the second check. It doesn't feel right to accept it. Not after." He gestured vaguely at the news article. "If I may judge," Mrs. Patterson said, choosing her words carefully, "I think returning it would miss the point. She wasn't trying to embarrass you. She was demonstrating something about justice." Judge Henderson nodded slowly, remembering Sarah's words about accountability. In her actions, accepting the original fine without complaint, graciously acknowledging his authority even while revealing her identity, and then making a voluntary donation, she had shown more respect for his court than any amount of formal attire could have conveyed. His phone buzzed with a text from his daughter, a second-year law student. "Dad, did you really find Sarah Chen? My professor just mentioned it in constitutional law." Another knock on the door revealed Officer Martinez. "Judge, there's something you should see." He handed over the afternoon edition of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. A small sidebar article caught his eye. "Federal Prosecutor's Traffic Fine Becomes Lesson in Judicial Humility." "They're calling it a teaching moment," Martinez added with a slight smile. "The law schools are already requesting the transcript for their ethics classes." Judge Henderson set the paper aside and pulled out a legal pad. At the top, he wrote, "Proposed changes to traffic court procedures." The first item on his list. "Review all case files thoroughly before making assumptions." As he wrote, he could hear the usual afternoon traffic court session continuing down the hall. But something had changed. The routine sound of justice being administered now carried a different weight. Somewhere in the federal building across town, Sarah Chen was probably still in her casual clothes, working late into the night on a case that would actually make a difference. The second check remained on his desk. a $250 donation to help keep school zones safe. Judge Henderson finally picked it up and placed it in his outbox for processing. Some lessons, he realized, were worth their price, and some traffic violations could teach more about justice than 1,000 proper court appearances. Mrs. Patterson lingered at the door. "Should I clear your schedule for the School Zone Safety Initiative presentation?" "Yes," Judge Henderson replied, a smile finally crossing his face. "Something tells me that's going to be a very interesting session." 6 weeks later, Judge Marcus Henderson's traffic court was packed to capacity. The usual defendants were joined by law students, local attorneys, and even a few curious judges from neighboring districts. The broken air conditioning had finally been fixed, but the anticipation in the room still made the air feel warm. Sarah Chen stood at the podium, now dressed in a crisp charcoal suit that befitted her position as Assistant U.S. Attorney. Her presentation on school zone safety and its intersection with federal investigations had drawn unprecedented attention to what would normally have been a routine traffic court session. The connection between school zone violations and larger criminal enterprises isn't immediately obvious, Sarah explained, clicking through a PowerPoint slide showing traffic patterns around local schools. "But we found that drug traffickers often use school rush hour traffic as cover for their operations, believing that law enforcement will be too busy with speeders to notice other suspicious activities." Judge Henderson watched from his bench as Sarah commanded the room's attention. The irony wasn't lost on him. 6 weeks ago, he'd lectured her about responsibility, and now she was teaching his entire court about the broader implications of traffic enforcement. In the gallery, the young law student who had witnessed the original incident sat front and center. His story about that day had already become legend at Georgia State University Law School, spawning a discussion panel on professional conduct and judicial discretion. Last month's operation, Sarah continued, began with a simple traffic stop in a school zone. An alert officer noticed something unusual about the driver's behavior, ran the plates, and discovered a connection to our ongoing corruption investigation. Sometimes, the smallest infractions can unravel the largest conspiracies. Mrs. Patterson, seated at her usual spot, noticed how Judge Henderson's demeanor had changed over the past 6 weeks. He still ran his courtroom efficiently, but there was a new thoughtfulness to his approach. Every case file was reviewed thoroughly before being called, and assumptions about defendants were noticeably absent from his rulings. As Sarah concluded her presentation, she shared one final slide. It showed the statistics from the School Zone Safety Program, the same program she had donated to on the day of her traffic hearing. The additional funds had helped install new speed monitoring equipment near 3 local elementary schools. In closing, Sarah said, "I want to thank Judge Henderson and this court for turning what could have been a routine traffic violation into an opportunity for positive change. Sometimes, justice works in unexpected ways." The applause that followed was genuine and enthusiastic. As Sarah gathered her materials, several attorneys approached to discuss potential collaborations between local and federal law enforcement. The boundaries between traffic court and federal proceedings didn't seem quite so rigid anymore. Judge Henderson stood, preparing to resume the day's regular docket. "Thank you, Assistant U.S. Attorney Chen," he said, his voice carrying the weight of lessons learned. "I believe we all gained something valuable from this experience." Sarah smiled, that same composed smile she'd worn 6 weeks ago. "The pleasure was mine, Your Honor. After all, no one is above the law, and sometimes the law has a way of humbling us all." As the crowd began to disperse, Officer Martinez approached the bench with the afternoon's cases. Among them was another school zone violation, and Judge Henderson found himself handling it with a new perspective. The fine he imposed was fair, measured, and accompanied by an explanation of why school zone safety mattered, not just for traffic control, but for the larger fabric of community security. The story of the federal prosecutor and the traffic court judge had become more than just a courthouse anecdote. It had evolved into a reminder that justice, in all its forms, deserved respect. Whether it was being served in a federal courtroom or a local traffic court, by someone in a designer suit or casual jeans. And somewhere in Sarah Chen's office, framed on her wall, hung a paid traffic citation, a simple piece of paper that had somehow managed to teach lessons about humility, professionalism, and the unexpected ways in which justice could be served.